How sailors stored fresh water on long voyages, collecting water before departure, gathering from wells and rivers the morning before a long voyage was never quiet. Even in a coastal town where ships came and went every week, the days before, a vessel's departure were marked by a particular kind of bustle. Carts rolled across the worn cobbles of the harbor road, wheels groaning under the weight of cargo, iron hoops on barrels clinking with every jolt. Sailors shouted to one another. In the salt-laden air, their voices echoing between timber warehouses and stone quaysides. Above all this, somewhere beyond the rattle of ropes and the hammering of caulkers working on the ship's seams, there was always the sound of water being poured, a steady, hollow splash into open casks. Fresh water was not something one simply had waiting in a dockside storehouse. It had to be gathered, measured, and prepared. And in the 1500s, this meant hauling it from where it naturally flowed, wells, rivers, and sometimes rain-fed ponds just beyond the town's walls. It was labor that began well before sunrise. In the dim light, men in hired porters would move in lines, carrying empty casks to the water source and returning with them sloshing and heavy. The casks themselves were no small burden. Even before they were filled, the oak staves and iron hoops made them awkward to carry, demanding strong arms and steady balance. The most reliable water came from the town's main well, a deep shaft, lined with stone and capped with a timber roof to keep out wind-blown debris. Here, a simple winch lowered a rope and bucket into the darkness. As the bucket descended, the rope hissed through the winch's spindle, its fibers smelling faintly of pitch. Then came the hollow splash far below, and a moment later the bucket returned dripping, water glistening in the morning light. Every bucketful was emptied into a waiting cask through a cloth funnel, the cloth catching leaves, grit, or the occasional small insect. Where a ship's crew numbered 50 or more, and where the voyage might stretch across weeks or months, the voyage might stretch across weeks or months. Amount of water needed was staggering. A single man might be allotted only a few pints per day for drinking, yet multiplied over weeks, the total became vast. For this reason, the well was not the only source. Beyond the edge of the harbor town, a slow-moving river wound its way toward the coast, its banks edged with reeds and willows. Here, larger teams could work, rolling empty casks down planks into small flat-bottomed boats that ferried them into deeper water for filling. The river water was often cooler and cleaner than that from shallow wells, but it required careful inspection. Any sign of upstream mills or tanneries was cause for caution. Such places could foul the water with dyes or the residue of hides. In some ports, water collectors would row a full mile upstream to avoid such hazards, trusting that the effort was worth the purity. The work was rhythmic. Lower the bucket, raise it, pour, move to the next. Wipe the rim of the cask, secure its lid loosely so air could escape during transport, then load it onto a waiting cart. The carts themselves were rough-hewn but strong, their beds lined with straw to cushion the barrels. Iron pins held the wheels to their axles, and each jolt of the cobblestones made the pins ring faintly, a sound that merged with the creak of harness, leather as horses leaned into their collars. The air near the water sources was always damp, carrying the earthy smell of moss, wet stone, and river mud. In the early hours, mist would curl along the surface, drifting in pale ribbons that caught the light as the sun rose. Men worked in shirt sleeves, the backs of their hands reddened. By cold water, their boots dark with splashes. Some wore wool caps pulled low, others had their hair tied back with strips of cloth to keep it out of their eyes as they bent over casks. Every filled barrel was a small victory in the long preparation for departure. It meant one more day's supply safely in hand, but collecting was only the beginning. The true care came in what happened next, filtering debris. Once the barrels arrived back at the dock, the work of refinement began. The water, no matter how clean it looked in the bucket, could not simply be sealed away. Small flecks of silt, fragments of leaves, and the occasional tiny insect would, if left inside, spoil the taste or even breed mold in the dark confines of the hold. This was where filtering became an essential step. The simplest filters were made from layers of cloth, often linen worn too thin for clothing, but still strong enough to strain water. A sailor would stretch the cloth across the open top of a smaller cask, tying it tight with hemp rope so it sagged slightly into the opening. Water from the gathering barrels was then poured slowly through, the first pour darkening the linen with sediment. The cloth would need rinsing often, wrung out and hung in the breeze before being replaced for the next pass. Some ports had more elaborate methods. In towns with access to fine river sand, water was poured through barrels half filled with sand and small pebbles. The sand caught debris while the pebbles kept the grains from washing away. This method, while slower, was valued for producing remarkably clear water. The filtered liquid, cool from passing through the sand, was then transferred into the final storage barrels. This was also the time when certain additives might be introduced. Those sailors did not have modern concepts of bacteria. They knew from hard experience that some things helped keep water sweet for longer. A small bundle of herbs, rosemary, thyme, or mint, might be dropped into the barrel to lend a fresher taste. In some cases, a small splash of wine or vinegar was added, not to make the water sour, but to slow its turning stale. This was not universally practiced, as every additive changed the flavor, and some crews disliked the taste. The smell of this work was a mix of fresh water, damp linen, and the sharper scent of crushed herbs. The dockside echoed with the muted slosh of pouring, the occasional thud of a mallet as a cooper checked the seams of a barrel, and the low murmur of men discussing how much more they still needed before the tide turned for departure. Filtering was not glamorous work. It was patient, repetitive, and often chilly, with cold water numbing the hands until they felt heavy. Yet every sailor knew its importance. Water was life, and once at sea there would be no quick remedy for a spoiled barrel. Filling barrels. On the dock with the water cleaned and ready. The final step before stowing it aboard was filling the main storage barrels. These were not the smaller casks used for gathering, but full-sized hogsheads and butts, great vessels of oak, their insides charred or treated with pitch to resist leaks. Each barrel had been prepared in advance, checked for cracks and in some cases re-hooped by the ship's cooper to ensure a tight seal. The filling was done slowly, often with the help of wooden funnels carved to fit snugly into the barrel's bunghole. A man would steady the funnel while another poured from a smaller container, the water trickling in with a soft gurgle. Too fast a pour would stir up any remaining sediment, so patience was key. Once full, the barrel was sealed with a tight fitting, bung hammered in with a mallet until it sat flush with the wood. The cooper's trained ear could tell when the seal was perfect by the change in pitch with each strike. These filled barrels were heavy beyond simple handling. Moving them required careful rolling along the dock, chocks placed at intervals to keep them from running away on the slight slope toward the water. Ropes were looped through iron rings to guide them down into the waiting ship's hold. Below deck, they would be stowed upright in rows, lashed to the ship's timbers to prevent shifting in rough seas. The dockside during this stage was a place of ordered chaos. Sailors shouted for more rope. Horses snorted as they hauled the last of the gathering carts away, and the ship's boatswain kept a running tally of how many barrels had been loaded. Each was marked with a chalk symbol to show it held fresh water, not beer, wine, or salted meat. Though in the dim light of the hold, the difference could be hard to spot without such markings. By the time the last barrel was loaded, the dock would be wet with spilled water, the wood darkened in patches. The men's clothes would be damp to the knees, their arms aching from the endless lifting and pouring. Yet there was satisfaction in the sight of a hold stacked with secure sealed barrels. It was the quiet reassurance that, whatever storms might come, the crew would have water to see them through, provided they guarded it well. Choosing the right containers, the craftsmanship of wooden barrels. For sailors preparing for long voyages in the 1500s, selecting and preparing the right containers for storing fresh water was among the most critical tasks. Among the many available options, wooden barrels stood at the forefront. These were not mere storage vessels. They were carefully crafted tools essential for preserving one of the most precious commodities aboard, fresh water. The process began well before the voyage. Skilled coopers, artisans trained in the secret arts of barrel making, worked tirelessly in workshops near ports. Their tools, curved knives, adzes, hammers, and hoop drivers, were designed to shape and assemble wood with precision. Oak was the wood of choice, valued for its density, durability, and natural resistance to rot. However, not just any oak could be used. The wood had to be seasoned, dried slowly over months or even years to remove moisture and prevent shrinking or warping. Once in use, the staves of a barrel were shaped with painstaking care. Each stave, a long, narrow piece of wood, was split and planed to a curved profile that would fit snugly against its neighbors. The curvature was essential, for the barrel's strength depended on the tension created when the staves were bound tightly by iron hoops. Even a slight gap could lead to leaks, an unacceptable risk when storing fresh water. After shaping, the coopers assembled the staves vertically within a temporary metal or wooden ring. Using heat, they steamed the wood to increase its flexibility, allowing the staves to bend into the barrel's rounded form. Once shaped, the iron hoops were hammered down in stages to compress the staves firmly, locking the structure in place. The ends of the barrel, called heads, were carefully fitted into grooves carved into the staves. These heads were themselves made of oak and sealed with pitch or resin to improve water tightness. A well-made barrel was a marvel of craftsmanship. It needed to be sturdy enough to withstand being rolled on rough dockside cobblestones, lifted repeatedly, and tossed in the ship's hold during storms. It also had to be watertight enough to prevent seepage over months at sea when every drop counted. The final touch was to coat the inside with pitch or tar. This practice helped seal microscopic gaps in the wood and gave the interior a dark, glossy finish. The pitch was applied carefully while hot, brushed across the interior surface, and allowed to harden. Sometimes, a barrel would also be toasted lightly to further reduce its porosity. Choosing the right barrels was a task left to the ship's captain and quartermaster, who inspected each cask personally. They tested for cracks, tightness of hoops, and smell. A barrel that smelled musty or sour was immediately discarded or repaired. Sometimes coopers would retighten hoops or replace damaged staves days before departure. Barrels came in various sizes. The largest, called butts or hogsheads, held up to 50 gallons and were used for main water storage. Smaller barrels, known as firkins or kegs, held less and were used for daily drinking water or special uses such as cooking or medicine. Each barrel was marked or branded to indicate its contents and capacity. The weight of a filled barrel was considerable. A 50-gallon barrel could weigh over 400 pounds when full of water, making careful handling essential. Teams of sailors would roll barrels on their edges, using their bodies to control momentum. Ropes or wooden chocks were used to stop barrels from rolling uncontrollably on inclined decks or docks. The cooperative relationship between sailors and coopers was vital. While coopers ensured the barrels were seaworthy and watertight, sailors learned to maintain them during the voyage. Tightening hoops, repairing leaks with pitch, or replacing bung plugs became routine tasks. A damaged barrel was not merely an inconvenience, but a serious threat to the entire crew's survival. Asterisk, sealed clay jars and other vessels, while wooden barrels were the primary containers aboard most European sailing ships of the 1500s. They were not the only options for storing fresh water. In certain regions and for specific purposes, sailors and merchants turned to sealed clay jars and other vessels, which offered distinct advantages and posed unique challenges. Clay jars, often known as amphorae when referring to Mediterranean vessels, were among the oldest types of water containers. Their rigid, impermeable walls made them ideal for keeping water fresh without the risk of leakage common to wooden barrels. However, their fragility and weight limited their use aboard ships that faced rough seas and frequent handling. The production of clay jars was an art in itself. Skilled potters shaped the vessels on wheels, forming narrow necks and rounded bodies designed to maximize storage while making the jar easier to carry and stack. Once shaped, the jars were dried and fired in kilns at high temperatures, a process that hardened the clay and made it water-resistant before being loaded onto ships. Clay jars were sealed carefully. The rims were coated with wax or pitch, creating a tight seal that prevented water from evaporating or becoming contaminated. Sometimes the jars were additionally covered with oilcloth or tide cloths to shield the opening from dust and insects. During storage and transit in Mediterranean ports, where amphorae were ubiquitous, they served not only for water, but also for wine, olive oil, and other liquids. Their narrow necks reduced the surface area exposed to air, slowing spoilage. Their shape also allowed for efficient packing in ship holds. Amphorae could be placed neck down in sand or straw-lined racks, minimizing movement during voyages. Despite these benefits, clay jars had clear drawbacks. Their weight added to the ship's burden, and their brittle nature meant a single jolt or fall could shatter a jar and waste precious water. As a result, they were often used in smaller numbers or reserved for short trips, coastal voyages, or special cargoes. On long voyages, sailors preferred the more durable wooden barrels, but sometimes supplemented their supplies with clay jars, especially for specific tasks like carrying medicinal water or potable water reserved for officers. Other vessels occasionally seen on ships included leather water bags and metal canisters, though these were far less common and generally served secondary roles due to their impracticality or expense. Leather water bags, often made from treated animal hides, were lightweight and flexible, easy to carry or hang. However, they were prone to drying out or developing leaks and required frequent maintenance. Metal containers, usually copper or tin-plated iron, were more durable but heavy and prone to corrosion from saltwater exposure. These were typically used for storing wine or spirits, rather than water. In every port and ship, the choice of water container reflected local customs, available materials, and the expected length and conditions of the voyage. The captain's preference, advice from experienced sailors, and the cooper's skill all played a role in ensuring the ship carried the safest and most reliable water stores possible. Small casks for quick access, alongside the large barrels and occasional clay jars. Sailors relied heavily on smaller casks or kegs for daily use during their long voyages. These smaller containers, typically holding between 5 and 15 gallons, played a vital role in making fresh water accessible without disturbing the main water stores. Deep in the ship's hold, small casks were crafted similarly to their larger counterparts, but with greater emphasis on portability. Their compact size meant they could be carried easily by 1 or 2 sailors, transported to the deck or officers' quarters as needed. This flexibility was crucial, especially during harsh weather or rough seas, when opening the hold could be hazardous. On many ships, these casks were kept near the galley or captain's cabin, where they were tapped regularly to provide water for cooking, drinking, and medical purposes. Having a dedicated supply of fresh water close at hand allowed the crew to avoid repeatedly opening the large barrels below, which helped maintain the overall integrity of the water stores and minimized contamination risks. Sailors also used small casks to ration water during times of scarcity. Officers or the ship's quartermaster could measure exact amounts to control consumption, preserving the main supply for emergencies or longer voyages. Construction-wise, small casks were often made with the same craftsmanship as the larger barrels, but with more attention to sturdiness over volume. The iron hoops were thicker, and the wood carefully selected to resist damage from frequent handling. The casks were sometimes fitted with spigots or taps, making it easier to draw water without opening the bung. Maintenance of these casks was a continual task. Leaks, though less disastrous in small containers, still had to be patched quickly using pitch, resin, or linen strips soaked in tar. A cracked small cask was often repaired mid-voyage, a testament to sailors' resourcefulness. During port stops, sailors would fill these casks first ensuring they had immediate access to fresh water without waiting for the entire ship to be stocked. On rough seas, these casks might be tied securely to prevent tipping or rolling, and their contents monitored closely. In some accounts, small casks were used to collect rainwater during storms, augmenting the ship's reserves. The portability made them ideal for gathering water from decks or improvised canvas funnels. Small casks were also sometimes used as barter items in foreign ports or among ships at sea. Their contents, fresh water, were always valuable, making them a kind of portable currency during long, thirsty voyages. Ultimately, these smaller vessels represented the day-to-day reality of managing water at sea. While large barrels guaranteed a bulk supply, it was the small casks that kept sailors hydrated and their meals prepared, bridging the gap between storage and consumption in the challenging environment aboard wooden ships. Preventing leakage. At sea. The threat of leakage and its consequences. On the vast, unpredictable oceans of the 1500s, fresh water was a sailor's most vital resource. Yet, despite the best efforts in gathering and storing it, the specter of leakage loomed large. A single cracked barrel or loose hoop could mean weeks or months of water lost to the unforgiving sea, turning what should be a life-sustaining resource into an insidious threat. Leakage was not a mere inconvenience. It was a matter of survival. Ships carried only so much water, calculated carefully to last the entire journey, plus an emergency margin, and once it was gone, there was no replacing it until the next port. Every drop wasted could shorten the voyage, cause rationing, and increase the risk of dehydration, illness, or death among the crew. The causes of leakage were many. Wooden barrels, while sturdy, were organic and subject to the whims of temperature, humidity, and rough handling. Wood expands and contracts with moisture and temperature changes. Iron hoops loosen or corrode. The constant movement of the ship in heavy seas applied pressure unevenly, jarring barrels and sometimes causing seams to separate. Even the best-made barrels could develop leaks during the voyage. The pitch sealing the interior could crack or wear thin. A bung might loosen or fall out. A stave might split. The possibility of damage was ever present, requiring vigilance and constant maintenance. Inspection and early detection. Preventing water loss began with early detection. The ship's quartermaster or cooper would inspect barrels regularly, often daily. This involved checking the tightness of the hoops by tapping them lightly with a mallet and listening for changes in sound, feeling the wood for softness or damp, spots, and examining bungs for secure fitting. Any sign of dampness outside a barrel was a red flag. Darkened wood or puddles on the deck indicated a leak, which, if left unattended, could worsen quickly. Sailors learned to identify the subtle signs of a developing breach: a swelling stave, a loosened hoop, or an unusual creaking sound during rough seas. The cooper, if aboard, was the expert tasked with repairs. Skilled in the art of woodwork and sealants, he carried tools and materials needed for emergency fixes: pitch, tar, spare staves, mallets, and ropes. Often he worked in cramped, dimly lit holds, lying on wooden beams to reach barrels deep within the ship's belly. Repair techniques and materials. When a leak was found, the cooper's response had to be swift and effective. Simple cracks might be sealed with hot pitch poured carefully into the breach, then allowed to harden. Pitch was a sticky, tar-like substance derived from pine resin, prized for its waterproofing qualities. For more serious damage, the cooper might remove a damaged stave entirely and replace it with a new piece of oak, shaped to fit perfectly into the gap. This required steaming the replacement stave to make it pliable, fitting it into place, and then tightening the hoops to compress the barrel once more. Bungs that had loosened were hammered back firmly, sometimes replaced with new wooden plugs, soaked in water to swell and form a tight seal dot in cases where immediate repairs were impossible, such as in rough weather. The crew might rig temporary patches using cloth soaked in pitch or resin. These were crude, but could hold until the ship reached calmer seas or port. Additionally, sailors learned to protect barrels from physical damage by lashing them securely and placing chocks to prevent rolling. Padding such as straw or cloth was used to cushion barrels and reduce shocks. The maintenance of barrels was a continuous battle. Heat and cold, salt air, and constant motion worked against the ship's water stores. Sailors learned to monitor humidity and temperature inside the hold, sometimes opening hatches briefly to circulate air and prevent mold or rot. Pitch was a natural resin obtained primarily from pine trees, a dark, sticky substance that became indispensable in maritime life. The process of collecting and preparing pitch was itself a careful craft, often carried out in coastal villages, where pine forests grew thick. Large logs of pine would be heated slowly in covered pits to release resin, which was then gathered and boiled down to a thick, tar-like consistency. The qualities that made pitch so valuable were numerous. It was waterproof, resistant to rot, and flexible enough to seal gaps in wood without cracking under the ship's constant motion. When applied to barrels and the ship's timbers, pitch formed a durable barrier that kept water inside and seawater and humidity out. Before a voyage, coopers would brush the interior surfaces of freshly made barrels with hot pitch. This coating sealed microscopic pores in the oak, making the wood less absorbent and preventing water from seeping through the staves. It also prevented the growth of mold and bacteria, which could spoil water and endanger the crew's health. Pitch was also used externally, sealing cracks or leaks as they developed during the voyage. Sailors carried pots of hot pitch aboard, ships applying it with brushes or wooden paddles during repair work. When poured into small cracks, the pitch hardened quickly, creating a near-permanent waterproof patch. The smell of pitch was omnipresent aboard ships, a sharp, resinous scent mingling with salt, tar, and sweat. While some found it unpleasant, sailors recognized it as a sign of a well-maintained vessel. Other sealants complemented pitch. Tar, a related substance also derived from pine, was often used to coat the ship's hull below the waterline, preventing wood rot and barnacle growth. Rosin and waxes were sometimes mixed with pitch to adjust its consistency or improve adhesion. The effectiveness of pitch depended heavily on its quality and application. Coopers and sailors had to heat it to the right temperature. Too hot, and it became too runny and wasted. Too cool, and it wouldn't penetrate pores or stick well. Timing was crucial. Pitch had to be applied quickly before it cooled and hardened. In addition to barrels, pitch was used to seal the ship's decks, joints, and rigging components. It was a vital line of defense against the elements, preserving the ship's structural integrity, as well as its vital water stores. The chapter also explores the risks associated with pitch handling. Hot pitch could cause burns, and it's sticky. Nature made cleaning tools difficult. Sailors developed routines for applying pitch safely, often working in pairs and near fires designed specifically for heating pitch. Throughout long voyages, pitch supplies were rationed carefully. Replenishment at port was essential, and captains made sure their ships were stocked well before departure. The quality of pitch available at different ports varied, affecting how well ships could maintain their barrels and hulls. Asterisk. Storing fresh water on long sea voyages was only half the battle. Keeping it drinkable over weeks and months presented constant challenges. Those sailors in the 1500s did not understand germs or bacteria. They learned through experience how water could spoil, become foul, or even dangerous. One persistent problem was that water stored in wooden barrels often developed unpleasant odors and tastes. The oak wood and pitch used to make the barrels imparted their own flavors. Over time, the water could become stale or acquire a musty smell, making it difficult to drink. Warm temperatures below decks sped up this process, encouraging the growth of molds and microscopic life forms that sailors could not see, but whose effects they endured. Water contamination was a constant threat. Dirt, salt spray carried by the wind, or tiny particles introduced during handling could ruin the supply. Barrels opened frequently increased the risk of foreign matter getting inside. Sometimes seawater seeped in through cracks or loosened barrels, spoiling the fresh water and putting the crew's health in jeopardy. Below decks, ventilation was poor and the air stale. The cramped, dark holds trapped humidity, creating ideal conditions for harmful growths. Sediments and debris settled at the bottom of barrels, providing a breeding ground for organisms that caused illness. Many sailors suffered from diseases, like dysentery or scurvy linked to contaminated or insufficient water. Despite these dangers, sailors developed practical ways to preserve water quality. Barrels were stored in the coolest, darkest parts of the ship to reduce heat and light exposure, both of which accelerated spoilage. Keeping barrels away from the sun and heat sources helped keep water fresher longer. To limit contamination, barrels were opened only when necessary. Smaller casks or containers held the daily drinking supply, reducing disturbance of the main. Water stores. These smaller vessels were easier to clean and allowed the crew to draw water without risking the larger barrels. Natural preservatives sometimes helped. Herbs such as rosemary, thyme, or bay leaves were steeped in water to mask odors and possibly slow spoilage. Though not scientifically proven, these practices came from sailors' traditions and observations. When possible, barrels were cleaned and rinsed, especially at ports. Some crews rinsed barrels with seawater before refilling with fresh water. Though it seems odd, salt water helped clean out residues without spoiling the new supply. Barrels were then left open briefly to air dry, reducing mold and bacteria buildup. Removing sediment was a crucial task. Over time, organic matter and particles settled at the bottom, clouding the water and making it unpleasant. Sailors used wooden scrapers to clean out this sludge, often working in cramped, poorly lit spaces. The quality of the water was monitored closely. captains and quartermasters regularly tasted and smelled the water. If it tasted bitter, smelled sour, or appeared cloudy, it was deemed unsafe or undesirable. When water spoiled, rationing became more severe, making survival even harder. To refresh stale water, sailors transferred it between barrels, a process known as aeration. Pouring water from one barrel to another introduced oxygen, improving taste and reducing flatness. This required careful coordination to avoid wasting precious water. When supplies ran dangerously low or spoiled, crews turned to other sources. Rainwater harvesting was common during storms, using sails or tarps to channel rain into clean containers. While unpredictable, rainwater was a vital lifeline. In cold climates or seasons, melting ice or snow provided fresh water. Crew members collected ice from decks or nearby environments, carefully melting it over fires to conserve every drop. Many famous voyages faced water crises, with spoiled supplies threatening the entire crew. Some ended tragically due to contaminated water, while others survived through diligent care and resourcefulness. Though they lacked modern science, sailors developed practical wisdom over generations. Their skills in preserving water helped them navigate the world's oceans, keeping their most precious resource safe for the journey ahead. Sailors' daily routines included constant vigilance over their water supplies. Each morning, before the sun climbed high, the crew would inspect their barrels and smaller containers, checking for any sign of leaks, discoloration, or foul smells. Maintaining cleanliness around the water stores was crucial, as any dirt or debris near the openings risked contamination. The storage location of water barrels was carefully chosen, deep in the ship's hold, away from heat sources and direct sunlight. The barrels were stacked tightly together, often cushioned with straw or cloth to minimize movement and damage during rough seas. This placement helped keep the water cool and slowed down spoilage. Because the crew's survival depended on water, discipline around its use was strict. Officers controlled rationing, especially when supplies began to dwindle. Drinking water was often reserved for cooking and medical needs, while sailors sometimes resorted to diluted or less frequent consumption to stretch supplies. To reduce contamination when drawing water, sailors used clean cups or ladles, often rinsed with fresh water before and after use. Hands were washed as often as possible, though salt and grime made this difficult. When rain was available, it was collected not only for drinking, but also for washing tools and containers, helping maintain hygiene. One innovative method to keep water fresh involved using charcoal. Pieces of charcoal, known for their purifying properties, were sometimes placed inside barrels or smaller containers. The charcoal absorbed impurities and odors, improving the taste and safety of the water. Though not a perfect solution, it helped prolong the usability of limited supplies. Throughout the voyage, the crew constantly adapted to conditions. On hot days when water demand rose, rationing tightened, and extra care was taken to avoid spills or waste. In storms, when barrels could shift violently, extra lashings and padding protected the containers, ensuring no sudden damage caused leaks. The value of fresh water could not be overstated. It was literally a matter of life and death. Successful voyages were those where water was carefully stored, maintained, and rationed with skill and foresight. Failures often traced back to spoiled water or leakage that forced ships to stop prematurely or face dire consequences. This practical knowledge was handed down over centuries, with each crew learning from the successes and mistakes of those before them. The strategies developed like proper barrel placement, regular inspections, use of natural preservatives, and creative solutions such as rainwater collection formed the foundation of maritime survival. Without fresh water, no matter how skilled the sailors or how sturdy the ship, a voyage would be doomed. The delicate balance of gathering, storing, preserving, and rationing water was one of the greatest challenges faced by sailors venturing into the unknown. Rainwater collection was a crucial lifeline for sailors when their stored fresh water ran low or became unusable. Though unpredictable, rain offered an opportunity to replenish supplies naturally without waiting for a port call. To capture as much of this precious resource as possible, sailors used a variety of ingenious methods and tools. Sails and tarps, usually made from tightly woven canvas, were spread across the ship's rigging or deck to catch falling rain. These large fabric surfaces channeled water into gutters or funnels constructed from wood or metal, which directed the flow into barrels or smaller containers. During storms, the crew worked quickly to spread these catchments before the rain passed, knowing each drop could mean the difference between thirst and survival. Specially designed funnels sometimes lined the ship's railings or were attached to the rigging to maximize water collection. These funnels were often detachable and carefully stored when not in use to prevent damage. Their size and shape varied, adapted to the ship's design and the crew's experience. Collecting rainwater was not without its challenges. Salt spray mixed with rain could contaminate the water, so sailors positioned catchments to minimize exposure to sea spray. They also took care to keep catchment surfaces clean, wiping off bird droppings, dust, or dirt that might fall onto the sails or tarps. Once collected, rainwater was poured into barrels, sometimes after being filtered through cloth to remove debris. This water was often considered fresher and better tasting than stored supplies, boosting morale among the crew. Beyond rain, sailors sought other sources of fresh water during voyages. In colder regions or during winter months, ice and snow could be gathered from the ship's deck or surrounding environment. Carefully melting ice over small fires or stoves, the crew converted these frozen reserves into drinking water. This method was especially important on northern voyages, where fresh water sources were scarce and rain was infrequent. Melting ice required fuel, so it was used sparingly and often prioritized for officers or medical needs. In some cases, ships would stop near rivers or streams to fill barrels with fresh water. However, this was not always possible, especially on open ocean voyages. When land was accessible, crews took great care to avoid polluted or salty water sources, sometimes testing water by taste or appearance before filling barrels. The constant search for fresh water influenced navigation decisions. Captains planned routes with known water sources in mind, balancing speed and safety against the need to resupply. This delicate planning was vital for successful voyages. Water rationing remained a harsh reality throughout. Even with rain and ice, supplies were never guaranteed. Discipline and resourcefulness became essential virtues among sailors, who learned to conserve water wherever possible, from drinking to cooking to washing. Through these combined efforts, careful storage, maintenance, and supplementation, sailors managed to sustain themselves on the world's oceans for weeks and months. The availability of fresh water dictated the length and success of their journeys, shaping the course of exploration and trade for centuries. For sailors in the 1500s, the barrel was far more than just a container. It was a vital lifeline that carried one of the most precious resources on board: fresh water. The design, construction, and selection of barrels were critical to ensuring that water could be stored securely for weeks or even months at sea. Each barrel was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, combining traditional woodworking skills with practical knowledge born of centuries of maritime experience. Barrels were typically made from oak, prized for its durability, tight grain, and natural resistance to rot. Oak's cellular structure allowed it to swell when wet, creating a natural seal between the staves. The process of selecting timber began well before the ship was built. Wood had to be carefully harvested, seasoned, and shaped to ensure it would perform well in harsh sea conditions. The staves, the narrow strips of wood that formed the barrel's body, were curved and tapered with precision to fit together seamlessly. This curvature was essential to creating a watertight seal. Once the barrel was assembled and the hoops tightened, the skill of the cooper, the craftsman responsible for barrel making, was measured in their ability to produce barrels that could hold liquid without leaking. Iron or sometimes wooden hoops were used to hold the staves firmly together. These hoops were heated and fitted tightly around the barrel before cooling, shrinking to compress the wood and ensure a solid seal. Over time, hoops could rust or loosen, requiring maintenance during the voyage. The barrel's ends, called heads, were also carefully crafted to fit snugly within grooves at the ends of the staves. The precision of these joints was critical to preventing leaks. Bungs, small wooden plugs, sealed the access holes drilled in barrels, allowing water to be poured in or drawn out without exposing the entire barrel to contamination. The size of barrels varied depending on their intended use. Water barrels were generally large enough to hold substantial quantities, between 30 and 50 gallons, to minimize the number of containers while maximizing storage capacity. However, they also had to be manageable for crew members to move and handle, especially during loading, unloading, and maintenance. Construction methods reflected a balance between durability and weight. Barrels had to be strong enough to withstand rough seas and handling, but light enough not to overly burden the ship's cargo capacity. Before loading, barrels were often seasoned by filling them with water for several days to allow the wood to swell and form tight seals. This process, called wetting in, helped prevent leaks during the voyage. The selection of barrels was another careful decision. Captains and quartermasters chose barrels based on their condition, size, and previous performance. Used barrels from earlier voyages were inspected thoroughly, and only those with intact staves and tight hoops were reused. New barrels were tested and sometimes modified to suit specific needs. In addition to holding fresh water, barrels carried other liquids such as salted meat juices, wine, and oil. Each type required slightly different preparation and handling, influencing construction choices. Throughout the voyage, the maintenance of barrels was continuous. Sailors checked for cracks, loose hoops, or swelling, performing repairs as needed. The cooper was an indispensable member of the crew, skilled in making emergency fixes using tools and materials aboard dot the design and craftsmanship of barrels. Not only preserved vital water supplies, but also symbolized the ingenuity and resourcefulness of maritime culture. Without reliable barrels, long voyages would have been impossible, and the age of exploration and trade would have been curtailed. Asterisk, wood selection and preparation were fundamental steps in crafting barrels that could withstand the harsh conditions. At sea, oak was favored not only for its strength, but for its natural tannins, which helped resist rot and insect damage. Before being shaped into staves, logs were carefully cut and left to season, a process that sometimes lasted months or even years. This aging reduced moisture content and stabilized the wood, preventing warping and shrinkage during use. Coopers meticulously examined each piece of timber, selecting those free from knots, cracks, or defects that might compromise the barrels. Integrity. The staves had to be uniformly thick and precisely curved to ensure a tight fit. They used specialized tools such as planes, draw knives, and crozes to shape and smooth the wood. The assembly of a barrel was a complex and delicate operation. Staves were first arranged upright within a temporary hoop to form the barrel's basic shape. Once aligned, the cooper heated the staves over open fires or steam to make the wood pliable, enabling them to bend into the characteristic rounded form. This bending was critical. Improper shaping could cause leaks or structural weakness. Permanent. Hoops were then driven over the staves while still warm, contracting as they cooled to hold the barrel firmly together. The number of hoops varied with barrel size, typically ranging from 6 to 8, spaced evenly to distribute pressure. Heads were crafted separately and fitted into grooves carved along the barrel's ends. These ends had to fit snugly, and grooves, called crozes, had to be perfectly cut to prevent leakage. Bungs, the removable plugs, allowed sailors to fill or draw water while keeping the barrel sealed when not in use. Quality control was rigorous. Before a barrel left the cooperage, it underwent a water tightness test. This often involved filling the barrel with water and observing any leaks over several days. Repairs were made as necessary, including retightening hoops or resealing seams. With pitch dot during voyages, barrels faced numerous threats. Constant exposure to salt air and moisture caused iron hoops to rust, potentially loosening their grip. The wood itself could swell or shrink due to changes in temperature and humidity, leading to gaps. Sailors learned to watch for early signs of failure and carry tools for on-the-spot repairs. The cooper's role extended beyond initial construction. Aboard ship, they performed maintenance, such as tightening hoops using hammer and hoop driver, tools, patching cracks with hot pitch, or replacing damaged staves. These repairs required skill and improvisation, often conducted in cramped, unstable conditions. Barrel design also evolved to meet specific maritime needs. Some barrels featured reinforced bands or extra hoops for voyages expected to be particularly long or rough. Others were lined internally with pitch or tar to improve waterproofing. Innovations like double-hooped barrels or specialized sealing compounds emerged as coopers experimented with improving durability. Handling barrels aboard ship required care to prevent damage. They were secured with ropes and chocks to avoid rolling. During rough seas, moving barrels involved coordinated effort. Sailors used ropes, pulleys, and wooden rollers to shift heavy containers without causing cracks. The importance of barrels in maritime logistics extended beyond water storage. They carried salted meats, grains, wine, and other provisions essential to the crew's survival. The craftsmanship that went into each barrel reflected a balance between utility, durability, and economy. The knowledge of barrel making and maintenance was deeply embedded in seafaring communities. Often, coopers were experienced artisans trained through apprenticeships, passing skills through generations. Their expertise was indispensable, and their tools and techniques formed a unique maritime tradition. The barrel's humble appearance masked its crucial role in the success of voyages that expanded trade routes, exploration, and cultural exchange across continents. Without the careful selection of materials, expert construction, and constant maintenance, crews would have faced far greater hardship and higher mortality on long journeys. Choosing the best spots to store barrels on ships. In the era of wooden sailing ships, fresh water was a precious and limited resource. The survival of the crew depended not only on how well water was stored, but where it was stored aboard the ship. The placement of water barrels within the ship's structure had a profound impact on the quality and longevity of the water supply throughout long voyages. The ship's hold, located in the lower part of the vessel below the main deck, was the primary storage area for barrels. This space was chosen for several key reasons. First, it was shielded from direct sunlight and external weather conditions, which helped maintain cooler temperatures. Fresh water kept in cool, shaded areas resisted spoilage far better than water exposed to heat or fluctuating temperatures. The hold's relative darkness also reduced the chance for algae or mold growth inside barrels, which could happen if light reached the water. Temperature control was essential because heat accelerated the degradation of stored water. Wooden barrels, while sturdy, were permeable to some degree. Over time, the warmth could cause expansion and contraction in the wood, loosening the joints between staves and increasing the risk of leaks. Warm water itself became stale faster and was more likely to develop unpleasant tastes or odors that discouraged drinking, threatening the crew's health. In addition to shelter from light and heat, the hold was protected from the physical dangers posed by rough seas. The rolling and pitching of a ship on the open ocean meant that barrels could be tossed about, potentially cracking or breaking if not secured properly. The hold's confined space allowed sailors to stack barrels snugly and use supporting beams, or wooden dunnage, small blocks of wood, to prevent movement. The tighter the barrels were packed, the less chance they had to shift dangerously during storms. Humidity in the hold was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the enclosed space helped protect barrels from drying out excessively, which could cause staves to shrink and leak. On the other hand, poor ventilation led to stagnant, damp air that encouraged mold and rot on the barrel's outer surfaces. To mitigate this, sailors arranged barrels to allow some airflow between them, sometimes using straw or cloth as padding to absorb moisture and prevent direct contact that could trap water and promote decay. The hold's floor was another consideration. Direct contact with the ship's wooden planks, which could be damp or infested with mold, risked damaging the barrels from below. To protect them, Barrels were often placed on raised platforms made of wood or packed with straw or sawdust. This not only preserved the barrels, but helped keep the water inside cleaner by reducing the risk of external contamination seeping through any weak points in the wood. Placement was also influenced by the type of cargo the ship carried. On trading, vessels, barrels filled with fresh water competed for space with barrels of salted meat, wine, oil, and other provisions. Sailors had to arrange cargo carefully, balancing accessibility and protection. Water barrels needed to be reachable for regular inspection and rationing, but not so exposed as to risk damage or contamination from other goods. Sometimes, barrels were stored closer to the galley, the ship's cooking area, to make access for food preparation easier. However, this came with risks. The galley generated heat and smoke, both detrimental to the wood and water quality. Barrels placed near cooking fires were subject to temperature fluctuations and soot, which could affect the water's taste and the barrel's integrity. On some ships, additional barrels were kept on upper decks. These were smaller, easier to access, and used for daily drinking or cooking. However, their exposure to the sun, rain, and sea spray meant that water stored here spoiled faster. Crews had to be vigilant about using this water quickly and replenishing it from the protected barrels below deck. The size and shape of barrels also affected where they could be stored. Larger barrels, capable of holding 40 or 50 gallons, were heavy and bulky, demanding sturdy supports and careful handling. Smaller barrels or casks were more mobile and often stored in areas with less space but greater accessibility. Over the course of a voyage, sailors rotated barrels regularly, drawing from those filled earliest to prevent old water from stagnating unnoticed. This practice, an early form of inventory management, helped extend the overall supply's usability and reduce waste. Securing barrels against movement was vital. Ropes, lashings, and wooden wedges, known as chocks, were used extensively to hold barrels in place. During rough weather, these securing methods prevented barrels from rolling, colliding, or cracking, which would have led to catastrophic water loss. The location of water barrels was also strategic from a safety perspective. In case of fire or flooding, barrels had to be reachable for quick removal or protection. On warships, storing water below decks also helped keep it safe from enemy fire or boarding parties. The careful selection of storage spots, combined with daily inspection and maintenance routines, formed the foundation for preserving fresh water during long ocean voyages. Each decision, from the hold's layout to the stacking patterns, reflected centuries of seafaring wisdom, practical adaptation to the harsh realities of life at sea. Sailors learned to read the ship's environment, adjusting barrel placement depending on season, route, and expected weather conditions. In warmer climates, barrels might be moved deeper into shaded compartments. In colder regions, they might be kept slightly higher to avoid damp sea spray. Asterisk, the practice of carefully choosing barrel storage spots was not just about preservation, it was about survival. The right placement could mean the difference between quenching thirst and facing dehydration, between completing a voyage successfully or returning early due to spoiled supplies. Asterisk. Securing barrels properly aboard a ship was a daily necessity, especially during rough seas. The movement of a vessel on ocean waves created constant jostling and shifting of everything inside, including precious barrels of fresh water. Without careful restraint, barrels could roll, bump into each other, or even break open, wasting valuable resources and risking the crew's survival. Sailors used a combination of ropes, wooden wedges called chocks, and tight stacking to keep barrels firmly in place. Ropes were tied in intricate knots and lashings, anchoring barrels to beams, bulkheads, or other stable parts of the ship. The craftsmanship of these lashings was a skill learned through experience. Too loose and barrels would shift too tight, and the wood could crack under pressure. Chocks, small wooden blocks, shaped to fit snugly between barrels and the ship's structure, acted like wedges, preventing any rolling movement. When barrels were stacked, chocks were placed between layers and around edges to create a tightly packed, interlocking formation. This packing limited movement and absorbed shocks from the ship's motion. Proper stacking was essential. Barrels were arranged in rows, with heavier barrels on the bottom and lighter ones on top, balancing the load and reducing pressure points. The formation also allowed for air circulation, preventing dampness buildup and encouraging ventilation around the barrels. Regular inspections were part of the sailors' daily routine. Crew members checked lashings and chocks for wear or loosening, tightening, or replacing them as needed. They looked for cracks in the wood or rust on iron hoops, both signs that a barrel might soon leak. Detecting and repairing damage early saved water and prevented larger problems. Maintenance of barrels went beyond external care. Sailors monitored the water quality inside by taste, smell, and appearance. If water began to taste stale or develop a strange odor, the crew might decide to transfer it to another barrel or use it quickly before it spoiled. This vigilance helped extend the usability of limited supplies. In cases where barrels leaked, quick repairs were necessary. Sailors used hot pitch, a sticky, tar-like substance, to seal cracks or holes. Pitch was heated until soft, then applied carefully to damaged areas. Once cooled, it hardened into a waterproof seal. This method was not permanent, but could hold until the ship reached port or more extensive repairs were possible. The cooper, the ship's barrel specialist, was invaluable in these efforts. Experienced in woodworking and repair, the cooper carried a set of tools including mallets, adzes, planes, and hoop drivers. Their skill enabled them to replace broken staves, tighten hoops, and refurbish barrels even in the cramped, moving environment of a ship's hold. When weather conditions worsened, securing barrels became even more critical. Storms brought violent rolling and pitching, and crew members often spent hours reinforcing lashings and adding extra chocks to protect the water supply. The safety of the crew depended on these efforts. A broken barrel meant less drinking water and a higher risk of dehydration. Barrels also needed protection from external contaminants. Sailors kept the hold as clean as possible, removing any spilled cargo, dirt, or debris that could damage barrels or enter the water. They wiped down barrel surfaces regularly, preventing mold or mildew buildup that could weaken the wood or cause odors to seep into the water. To prevent contamination during use, barrels were opened carefully. The bungholes were sealed tightly. When not in use, and when water was drawn, cups or ladles were rinsed before and after each use. Minimizing exposure to air and foreign particles was crucial to keeping water fresh. Temperature fluctuations within the hold posed another challenge. Cold temperatures could cause wood to contract and loosen joints, while heat led to swelling and increased the risk of leaks. Sailors adapted by monitoring conditions and adjusting storage methods accordingly, sometimes repositioning barrels or adding insulating materials like straw or cloth around them. Despite all precautions, barrels aged over time. Constant exposure to moisture and salt air caused wood fibers to weaken and iron hoops to corrode. By the end of a long voyage, many barrels showed signs of wear. Captains balanced the need to use older barrels before they failed against the risk of spoilage, managing supplies carefully. Training the crew in barrel care was essential. The cooper often taught sailors basic maintenance skills, enabling them to assist with repairs or spot problems early. This shared responsibility helped preserve water supplies when the cooper was occupied elsewhere. The ongoing maintenance of barrels was a form of survival, skill passed down through generations of sailors. Their practical knowledge of materials, tools, and shipboard conditions ensured that fresh water lasted as long as possible, often making the difference between success and failure on long ocean journeys. In sum, securing and maintaining barrels on ships involved continuous effort and attention to detail. It was a teamwork exercise requiring skill, knowledge, and discipline. Every knot tied, every crack patched, every inspection made contributed directly to the health and endurance of the crew at sea. Handling and transporting barrels on board was a demanding task that required coordination and care. Barrels were heavy, awkward to move, and essential to preserve intact. Moving them safely during loading, unloading, and throughout the voyage was critical to keeping fresh water supplies secure. When loading barrels onto the ship before departure, dock workers and sailors worked together using a system of ropes, pulleys, and wooden rollers. The barrels were lifted carefully from carts or wagons onto the ship's deck, then lowered into the hold using block and tackle setups. The crew guided barrels to their assigned storage spots, often working in teams to avoid dropping or bumping. Then, because barrels were round and could roll easily, special wooden cradles or racks were sometimes used to hold them steady while moving or storing. These cradles prevented barrels from shifting and made it easier to stack barrels securely in tight spaces. Once aboard, barrels had to be carried or rolled into place. Rolling a barrel was easier than lifting, but still required strength and caution. Sailors rolled barrels along wooden planks or deck surfaces, using their hands or simple tools to guide and control movement. Sudden drops or collisions could crack staves or break hoops, causing leaks on smaller ships or in cramped spaces. Barrels were sometimes carried by 2 or more sailors using harnesses or slings made from rope. This method required teamwork and communication, especially on unstable decks or during rough seas. Throughout the voyage, barrels might be shifted to access other cargo or to adjust the ship's balance. Moving barrels in a rolling, pitching environment was dangerous, demanding experienced hands and careful timing. When it came to daily use, fresh water was rarely taken directly from the large barrels. Instead, smaller containers like wooden buckets or jugs were filled from the barrels to distribute water among the crew. This reduced the number of times large barrels had to be opened, minimizing exposure to contaminants and preserving the water's freshness. Rationing water was a strict and essential part of life at sea. Captains and officers controlled how much water each sailor could consume each day. These rations varied depending on the voyage's length, weather, and water availability, but were always limited to conserve supplies. During hot weather or strenuous activity, rationing could become particularly difficult. Sailors learned to manage thirst and make the most of their allotted water, often drinking small sips throughout the day rather than large amounts at once. Water was also used for cooking, cleaning, and medical needs, making rationing a complex balancing act. The ship's cook relied on careful measurement to avoid wasting water, while the surgeon needed water for treating wounds and illnesses. The barrels themselves were protected from contamination. During these daily operations, the bunghole, a small opening sealed with a wooden plug, was opened carefully to fill containers. Crew members wiped the area clean before opening and replaced the bung securely afterward. If barrels showed signs of contamination, such as cloudiness or foul smell, water was sometimes transferred to another barrel or container to isolate the spoiled supply. This transfer was done with clean tools and cloth filters to reduce debris in port. Sailors often refilled barrels with fresh water sourced from rivers, wells, or cisterns. Loading fresh water required the same care as the initial loading, ensuring barrels were clean and free from damage to protect the new supply. Despite all efforts, water supplies sometimes ran low before reaching the next port. In such cases, sailors rationed even more strictly and turned to collecting rainwater or melting ice when available. As described earlier, the daily handling, careful distribution, and rationing of water reflected the importance of barrels and their contents. Without skilled management, even the best barrels and storage methods could not guarantee survival on long voyages. Through this careful and constant attention to handling and rationing, sailors preserved the precious resource of fresh water, sustaining themselves across vast and often hostile oceans. Keeping fresh water safe from contamination was a constant challenge aboard sailing ships in the 1500s. The quality of water stored in barrels could mean the difference between health and illness, survival and hardship for the crew. Sailors understood early on that protecting water from dirt, salt, and spoilage required careful measures at every stage from storage to daily use. The main source of contamination was the environment itself. Ships were exposed to salt spray, dust, dirt, and organic debris that could easily find its way into water supplies if barrels were opened carelessly or stored improperly. Even small amounts of salt water entering a barrel could spoil fresh water, making it undrinkable and dangerous. To reduce these risks, barrels were sealed tightly with bungs made of wood or cork. These plugs fit snugly into holes in the barrel's side and were removed only when absolutely necessary. After filling or drawing water, the bung was replaced carefully and sometimes sealed further with wax or pitch to prevent leaks and outside contamination. When sailors needed water, they avoided dipping dirty hands or unclean tools into barrels. Instead, they used dedicated cups or ladles, rinsed regularly to keep them clean. The crew was trained to treat water with respect knowing that careless behavior could lead to contamination and illness. During rough weather, barrels were kept sealed as much as possible. Opening a barrel in a storm risked spilling precious water and allowing rainwater mixed with salt spray to enter. Sailors waited for calmer moments to draw water or transferred supplies into smaller containers beforehand. Barrels were cleaned and maintained between voyages to remove any residue or buildup that could affect the taste or safety of water. Cleaning involved rinsing barrels with fresh water and sometimes scraping the inside surfaces to remove sediment or mold. This process was done by coopers or experienced sailors familiar with the proper techniques. In some cases, barrels were treated with natural preservatives. Though not fully understood scientifically, sailors observed that adding certain substances, such as charcoal or small amounts of vinegar, helped keep water fresher longer. These practices varied by region and tradition, but reflected practical knowledge passed down through generations. The design of barrels also played a role in preventing contamination. Tight-fitting staves and well-made heads ensured that the barrels remained watertight, reducing the risk of outside elements seeping in. The natural swelling of oak wood when wet further sealed gaps, creating a barrier against contaminants. Sailors also guarded against contamination by monitoring the barrels. Surroundings. The ship's hold was kept clean and dry, and spilled liquids, food scraps, or waste materials were promptly removed to prevent odors and bacteria from spreading. Water quality was tested regularly. Experienced crew members assessed water by taste, smell, and appearance. Any change, cloudiness, unusual odor, or discoloration was cause for concern. If water was suspected to be spoiled, it was used quickly or discarded to avoid health risks. The crew's health was directly linked to water quality. Contaminated water could cause dysentery, scurvy, and other illnesses that decimated crews. On long voyages, preventing contamination was thus not only about comfort, but survival. Throughout the journey, the strict control of access to barrels and careful handling of water reflected a deep understanding of the risks. The discipline instilled by captains and officers ensured that water contamination was minimized, preserving the crew's health and the success of the voyage. Finding ways to collect and replenish fresh water during long voyages was a constant concern for sailors. Since ships could only carry limited supplies, crew members had to rely on various techniques to gather water from natural sources or capture it directly from the environment. One of the most important methods was collecting rainwater. Rain was a precious gift at sea, and sailors prepared for its arrival by positioning barrels, lids, or specially made containers to catch as much as possible. When rain fell, crew quickly moved to open clean barrels or containers to collect water before it ran off the ship's decks or was lost. Ships were sometimes fitted with canvas or sailcloth, stretched over frames to channel rainwater into barrels or cisterns. These improvised catchment systems maximized the volume of fresh water gathered, making the most of brief storms or showers. Rainwater was considered the purest form of fresh water available during voyages, especially compared to stored supplies that might become stale or contaminated over time. However, collecting rainwater required good timing and maintenance of collection equipment to prevent debris from mixing with the water. In addition to rain, sailors replenished supplies at ports or islands. Stopping at friendly harbors allowed crews to fill barrels with fresh water from wells, springs, or cisterns on land. However, not all ports were reliable sources of clean water. Some had brackish or contaminated supplies, requiring careful testing before filling barrels. When fresh water was scarce or landfall impossible, sailors also resorted to capturing moisture from the air or sea. Techniques such as dew collection, using claws to absorb moisture overnight, were sometimes employed. Though limited in volume, these methods supplemented water supplies during extended stretches at sea. Some sailors used distillation methods to produce fresh water from seawater. While rudimentary and not widely available in the 1500s, early stills allowed boiling seawater and condensing the steam to yield drinkable water. These devices were complex and slow, used mainly on specialized ships or in emergencies. Rationing ensured that water collected from these methods lasted as long as possible. Even when rain was plentiful, storage and distribution remained critical to avoid waste or contamination. The challenge of replenishing water supplies shaped many aspects of ship design, voyage planning, and daily routines. The ability to capture rainwater or find clean sources on land influenced route choices and timing, with captains seeking ports known for good water or planning voyages around rainy seasons. Overall, collecting and replenishing fresh water at sea required ingenuity, preparation, and constant vigilance. These efforts were vital to sustaining crews through months or years of exploration, trade, and travel on the open ocean.